The lone cowboy sits by his campfire, a tin plate of beans warming on the flames, coffee bubbling in a battered pot. It's the image burned into our minds by 1,000 Western films. It's also almost completely wrong. The reality of what cowboys ate on the great cattle drives wasn't a simple campfire meal. It was a calculated system of survival built on food so bizarre that most modern Americans would struggle to swallow them. They drank coffee strong enough, legend said, to float a revolver. They ate bread so hard it earned the nickname gun wadding and had to be soaked just to chew. And when supplies ran low and an animal had to be slaughtered, they created dishes with names like son of a gun stew, a concoction that used, as one cowboy put it, everything but the hair, horns, and holler. This wasn't about taste, fresh steak, despite being surrounded by thousands of cattle, was a rare luxury most cowboys almost never tasted. The animals they herded represented their employer's entire investment, his walking profit margin. Killing a healthy steer for dinner was like a bank teller helping himself to the vault. So cowboys ate the lame, the sick, the too young to travel. They ate the parts of animals we've long since forgotten had culinary uses. They turned the byproducts of ranch work, things that would make a modern eater turn pale, into sought-after delicacies with surprisingly appetizing nicknames. The biggest shock isn't what they ate, it's why. Every single food choice on a cattle drive was made according to a brutal calculus. Will it spoil? Can we carry it? Does it pack enough calories to fuel 16-hour days? The answer created what cowboys called the Holy Trinity: beef, beans, and biscuits. But even within that simple formula lay a world of ingenuity and improvisation that Hollywood never bothered to show. Take beans. Cowboys didn't just eat them, they gave them nicknames that revealed their importance. Prairie fuel for the energy they provided. Whistleberries for their well-known digestive effects. A cook would start a pot of dried pintos soaking at dawn, let them jiggle in the back of the wagon all day to rehydrate, then slow cook them overnight to be ready for breakfast. They were cheap, didn't spoil, took up minimal space, and delivered protein when there was nothing else. They were also profoundly, relentlessly boring. But boredom was survivable. Hunger wasn't. And the man who stood between the crew and starvation wasn't the trail boss, the fastest gun, or the best rider. It was the camp cook, a figure so powerful and so feared that experienced cowboys would refuse to sign onto a drive if they knew the food would be bad. This man, universally called Cookie, was second in command and often the highest paid member of the crew. His domain was the Chuckwagon, a mobile kitchen invented in 1866 that revolutionized cattle drives, and within 100 feet of that wagon, his word was law. Cookie's rules weren't suggestions. Never ride your horse close enough to kick dust into the food. Never start eating until he gave the call. Never leave food on your plate. That was a grave insult. Even the coffee pot had its own protocol. If a cowboy went to pour himself a cup and someone shouted, "Man at the pot," he was obligated to serve anyone else who wanted one. Break these rules, and Cookie might make your life miserable in ways both petty and profound. Respect them, and you'd eat as well as the brutal circumstances allowed, because the circumstances were brutal. The cowboy diet was built for calories, not nutrition. It was dangerously deficient in vitamins, especially A and C, leading to a constant threat of scurvy on drives that lasted months without fresh produce. Disease killed far more cowboys than gunfights ever did. Cholera and dysentery spread through unsanitary camps. Exhaustion led to accidents. And the cure-all for everything from coughs to snake bites was whiskey, carried officially for medicinal purposes. Yet within these harsh constraints, cowboys developed a food culture of remarkable creativity. When a calf too weak to continue the drive had to be slaughtered, nothing went to waste. The heart, liver, tongue, kidneys, and brains all went into the stew pot. The marrow gut, a milk-filled tube found only in nursing calves, added a rich flavor that cowboys craved enough to give the dish its famous name. During roundup season, the inevitable byproducts of castration weren't discarded. They were seasoned, rolled in cornmeal, and fried until golden, becoming a delicacy known as calf fries, or Rocky Mountain Oysters, described as both nutty and gamey. This waste-nothing philosophy extended beyond cattle. When supplies ran desperately low, the definition of edible game expanded to include animals modern hunters would never consider: snakes, skunks. With pioneer guides offering detailed instructions on the critical importance of removing the scent glands first. Wild sheep sorrel, a tangy herb, became the key ingredient in a makeshift pie that substituted for the citrus cowboys couldn't carry. The real story of cowboy food isn't about rugged individualism. It's about desperate interdependence. It's about a cook who slept with his sourdough starter on cold nights to keep the yeast alive. It's about coffee that provided not just caffeine, but a daily ritual of warmth and consistency in a life defined by hardship. It's about men who turned scarcity into ingenuity, not because they were particularly noble, but because the alternative was starvation. What you're about to discover isn't the romantic fiction of campfire beans. It's the real mathematics of survival on the frontier, a world where every meal was a calculated gamble, every ingredient served multiple purposes, and the difference between eating well and eating poorly could determine whether a crew made it to market or fell apart halfway there. This is the story of what cowboys actually ate, and why each bizarre choice made perfect, brutal sense. The most unbelievable truth about cowboy food wasn't that it was monotonous or that it was hard. It's that some of their most celebrated dishes would make a modern eater's stomach turn. When a calf went down on the trail, too weak to continue, too young to survive the pace, the cook didn't waste time on sentiment. He butchered it methodically, and then he made a decision that separated trail cooks from town cooks. He used everything. Not just the obvious cuts of meat, but the organs, the offshoots, the parts that most people today wouldn't recognize as food. This wasn't cruelty or desperation in the Hollywood sense. It was cold mathematics. The crew needed protein. The calf was already dead. And throwing away edible nutrition when you were 3 weeks from the nearest town wasn't frontier toughness. It was frontier stupidity. The result was a dish with a name as rough as the life itself: son of a gun stew. One cowboy famously described the recipe as throwing everything in the pot but the hair, horns, and holler. That wasn't exaggeration. The stew started with the expected cuts, chunks of tender calf meat seasoned and browned. But then came the heart, sliced and added for texture, the liver, which brought a mineral richness, the tongue, surprisingly tender when cooked slow, the kidneys, which added a distinct, almost gamey depth. But the ingredients that made son of a gun stew legendary were two organs most modern Americans have never heard of. First, the brains. They were used as a natural thickener, dissolving into the stew and giving it a creamy consistency without the need for flour or cream, neither of which kept well on the trail. Second, and most prized, was something cowboys called the marrow gut, a tube-like organ found between a calf's stomachs that was only edible while the animal was still nursing. It contained partially digested milk, and when added to the stew, it provided a rich, slightly sweet flavor that cowboys genuinely craved. This wasn't survival food that men choked down. Old trail hands spoke about son-of-a-gun stew with actual fondness, the way someone today might reminisce about their grandmother's cooking. The flavor was complex, layered, deeply savory. It was also completely dependent on ingredients that could only come from a nursing calf, which meant it was rare enough to be special. When Cookie announced he was making it, that was a good day. The waste-nothing philosophy extended beyond the stew pot. During roundup season, when young bulls were castrated to make them easier to manage, the inevitable byproducts weren't discarded. They were transformed into another trail delicacy that came with an array of euphemistic names: calf fries, prairie oysters, or most famously, Rocky Mountain oysters. The preparation was straightforward. The organs were cleaned, sliced, seasoned with salt and pepper, rolled in cornmeal for coating, and fried in hot beef grease until they were golden and crispy on the outside. The result was described by those who ate them as having a flavor that was both nutty and gamey, with a texture somewhere between tender meat and firm custard. Cowboys considered them gourmet eating, not because they were desperate, but because when prepared well by a skilled cook, they were genuinely good. To modern sensibilities, this seems extreme, but on the frontier, it made perfect sense. Castration was happening anyway as part of routine ranch work. The byproducts were fresh, protein-rich, and available. Throwing them away would have been wasteful in a world where waste could mean the difference between a well-fed crew and a weak one. The cowboys who ate calf fries weren't performing some act of frontier machismo. They were eating what was available, and finding that it tasted better than the jerky and beans they'd been eating for weeks. This philosophy didn't stop at cattle. When trail supplies ran genuinely low, when the flour was nearly gone and the last of the coffee was being rationed, Cookie turned to the land itself. Cowboys hunted whatever game they could find. Deer and wild turkey were prized when available. Rabbit was common. But in the true spirit of waste-nothing survival, the definition of game could stretch considerably. Snakes, for instance. A rattlesnake, properly cleaned and fried, provided meat that was lean and surprisingly tender, often compared to chicken. Old pioneer guides from the era gave detailed instructions on preparation, treating snake meat as a perfectly reasonable food source rather than an act of desperation. More surprising still, skunks. Yes, drew actual skunks. The same pioneer guides that discussed snake preparation also included skunk, with the critical warning that the scent glands had to be removed carefully and completely before cooking. Done correctly, skunk meat was reportedly similar to rabbit. Done incorrectly, well, the consequences were obvious and permanent. Cowboys also foraged for wild plants, leading to some genuinely creative improvisation. One of the more inventive dishes was sheep sorrel pie. Sheep sorrel is a wild herb with a sharp lemony flavor, and it grew across much of the prairie. Cowboys would gather it and use it as a substitute for the citrus fruits they couldn't possibly carry on a months-long drive. Mixed with a bit of precious sugar and baked into a crust made from biscuit dough, it created a tart, the sweet dessert that broke the monotony of the standard diet. It wasn't just clever, it also helped prevent scurvy by providing vitamin C that was otherwise dangerously lacking. The ingenuity of these foods wasn't about bravery or toughness. It was about seeing possibility where others saw waste. A nursing calf that couldn't continue became the centerpiece of a celebrated stew. The byproducts of necessary ranch work became a delicacy. Wild plants that most people walked past became the key to preventing disease. This wasn't desperation cooking. It was frontier intelligence, the ability to look at what you had rather than what you lacked and turn it into survival. In a world that offered nothing for free, the ability to see food where others saw garbage was the difference between a crew that made it and one that didn't. But son-of-a-gun stew and Rocky Mountain oysters weren't daily fare. They were what happened when opportunity struck. The real backbone of survival on the trail came down to 3 foods that could actually make the journey. And the biggest irony? Cowboys spent months surrounded by thousands of head of beef, yet fresh steak was something most of them almost never tasted. Those cattle weren't food, they were inventory. A trail boss might be moving 2,000 steers north to market, representing an investment of tens of thousands of dollars, his entire financial future walking on 4 legs. Every animal that reached the railhead alive meant profit. Every animal lost to illness, accident, or a cowboy's appetite meant loss. The math was simple and unforgiving. So the beef cowboys actually ate came from the animals that couldn't make it anyway. The lame steer that went down with a broken leg, the sick animal that wouldn't survive another day's drive, the calf too young and weak to keep pace with the herd. Even then, fresh meat was consumed immediately or transformed. On the rare occasions when an animal was butchered, the cook worked fast. Steaks were cut and fried, but they were tough. These weren't grain-fed animals destined for fine dining. The real prize came after the frying, when the cook would throw flour into the sizzling beef grease left in the cast-iron skillet. This created a thick, savory gravy that cowboys called sop, or Texas butter, and it was ladled generously over biscuits. It was fat, salt, and beef essence, pure calories in a form that made even the hardest bread palatable. But most beef wasn't consumed fresh. It was jerky, and not the tender-flavored snack you'd find in a modern gas station. Trail jerky was a survival calculation. The cook would slice meat into thin strips, pack them with coarse salt, and hang them in the sun until they were hard as wood. The result was tough enough to require serious jaw work, salty enough to pull moisture from your mouth, and absolutely impervious to spoilage. Cowboys would gnaw on jerky during the day while riding, getting protein without stopping the herd. It wasn't pleasure, it was fuel. If beef was the luxury, beans were the foundation, the bedrock that the entire trail diet was built upon. Pinto beans, specifically. They were cheap enough to buy in bulk, nutritious enough to sustain hard labor, and compact enough that a Chuckwagon could carry hundreds of pounds without running out of space. But transforming dried beans into edible food was an all-day process that required planning and patience. The cook started in the morning, putting a massive pot of dried pintos to soak in water. That pot then spent the entire day jostling around in the back of the Chuckwagon as it rolled toward the next campsite, the movement helping the beans rehydrate. The moment the wagon stopped and camp was made, that pot of beans was the first thing placed over the fire. They'd simmer for hours, slow cooking through the evening and often through the night, to be ready for breakfast the next morning. By the time cowboys ate them, the beans had been in process for nearly 24 hours. The result was beans. Day after day, meal after meal, beans. Cowboys gave them affectionate nicknames that revealed both their importance and their inevitable effects. prairie fuel acknowledged the energy they provided for brutal physical labor. Whistleberries was a humorous nod to their digestive consequences. The monotony was brain-numbing, but monotony was survivable. Hunger wasn't. The third pillar was bread, and here the divide between skill and mere competence became obvious. The most prized form was the sourdough biscuit, and a cook's reputation often rested on his ability to produce them. The secret was the sourdough starter, a living culture of wild yeast that the cook maintained with almost obsessive care. He kept it in a crock, fed it daily with flour and water to keep the culture alive, and protected it like treasure. On cold nights, Cookie would sleep with the crock tucked against his body to prevent the yeast from dying in the freezing temperatures. That starter could be decades old, passed from cook to cook, and its unique flavor profile became a point of pride. When the starter was right and the cook skilled, sourdough biscuits were a revelation. Fluffy, tangy, substantial enough to soak up gravy and survive the journey from pan to plate in a dusty camp. They were comfort in carbohydrate form, a touch of craftsmanship in a life of brutal simplicity. At the opposite end of the spectrum was hardtack. This was survival food stripped to its absolute essence: flour, water, and salt, baked until it became nearly indestructible. Hardtack could last for years without spoiling, which made it invaluable. Because it was also so incredibly hard that Cowboys nicknamed it gun wadding after the material used to pack musket balls. You couldn't just bite into hardtack. You had to soak it in coffee or gravy until it softened enough to chew. It had no flavor beyond a faint saltiness. It existed purely as a delivery mechanism for calories and a hedge against starvation when everything else ran out. This was the Holy Trinity: beef that usually wasn't fresh, beans that took a full day to prepare, bread that ranged from a skilled cook's pride to something you could theoretically use as ammunition. Together, they formed a diet calculated not for pleasure, but for survival. Portable, preservable, and packed with enough calories to fuel men who spent 16 hours a day in the saddle. Every choice was deliberate. Beef jerky survived the heat. Beans provided protein without refrigeration. Sourdough could be maintained indefinitely with just flour and water. Even hardtack, as miserable as it was to eat, represented insurance against catastrophe. If the wagon broke down, if the herd stampeded and scattered the supplies, if anything went wrong, hardtack would still be there, rock hard, flavorless, and capable of keeping a man alive. The genius wasn't in the individual foods, it was in the system, a diet designed by necessity to function in conditions where a single mistake could mean starvation. Cowboys didn't eat beef, beans, and biscuits because they loved them. They ate them because these were the only foods that could make the journey and still be edible at the end. It wasn't cuisine. It was the mathematics of survival, calculated down to the last ounce of salt. But even the most carefully planned system needed someone to execute it. And out on the trail, that someone held more power than his title suggested, enough that experienced cowboys would refuse a job based solely on who was doing the cooking. The Chuckwagon wasn't just where food came from. It was the center of an entire world, and the man who controlled it was both servant and king. The Chuckwagon wasn't just a kitchen on wheels. It was the beating heart of the entire operation, and the man who ran it was the second most powerful person on the drive. Charles Goodnight invented the Chuckwagon in 1866, and in doing so, he fundamentally changed how cattle drives functioned. Before Goodnight's innovation, Trail crews had to pack supplies on mules or in standard wagons that weren't designed for the purpose. That Goodnight took a surplus army wagon, sturdy, reliable, built to handle rough terrain, and transformed it into a mobile headquarters. He added a chuck box to the back, a cabinet with drawers and compartments for storing everything from ground coffee to bandages. The tailgate folded down to create a work surface. The wagon bed carried not just food, but the crew's bedrolls, blacksmithing tools, branding irons, and emergency medical supplies. It was a general store, a hospital, a smithy, and a kitchen all in one, and it could keep a crew of 10 to 15 men operational for months in country where the nearest town might be a week's ride away. Presiding over this mobile kingdom was the cook, and his authority was both absolute and earned. Cookie was typically the second highest paid man on the entire drive, or earning more than even the most skilled cowboys. Only the trail boss made more, and that was because the trail boss owned the financial risk. But in terms of day-to-day power over the crew's quality of life, Cookie was unmatched. Experienced cowboys, the kind who could pick and choose their employment, would ask who was cooking before they'd sign on to a drive. A good cook meant decent food, which meant morale, which meant a crew that could endure the grinding monotony and occasional terror of moving cattle across hundreds of miles. A bad cook meant misery, discord, and the very real possibility that men would quit halfway through. Cookie's workday was relentless in a way that made even the cowboy's labor look manageable by comparison. He rose around 3 in the morning, often the first man awake in camp. His first task was starting the fire, and out on the treeless prairie that usually meant burning dried cow chips, the polite term for manure that had baked hard in the sun. While the fire built, he'd grind coffee beans with a hand crank mill, get water boiling, and start preparing breakfast. By the time the sky began to lighten, he'd have hot coffee ready and food cooking. The crew would eat quickly, saddle up, and ride out with the herd. And then Cookie's second shift began. He had to wash every tin plate and cup, pack the entire chuckwagon with a precision that kept breakables from shattering and supplies from spilling, hitch up his mule team, and drive ahead of the herd to reach the next campsite. He had to arrive early enough to set up, start the fire, and begin preparing the evening meal so it would be ready when the exhausted crew rode in after dark. There was no rest. There were no days off. The drive moved forward every day, and Cookie moved with it, often covering the same distance as the herd, but doing it while managing a heavily loaded wagon over terrain that could range from smooth prairie to rock-strewn gullies. But he was more than a cook. He was the trail's doctor, pulling teeth and treating injuries with whatever limited supplies and folk remedies he knew. A cowboy with a broken bone might get it splinted with wood from a broken wagon slat and wrapped with strips of cloth. A fever got treated with whiskey and rest. A bad tooth got yanked with pliers, often without anything to dull the pain beyond a slug of liquor. Cookie was the barber, though haircuts were rare and rough. Usually just a quick trim with scissors when a man's hair got long enough to be a nuisance. Some cowboys called him the banker because he often held the crew's wages for safekeeping, since a cowboy on the trail had nowhere to spend money anyway, and carrying cash invited trouble. And critically, Cookie was the navigator. Each night, he would point the chuckwagon's tongue, the long wooden beam that connected to the mule team, toward the North Star. In the morning, the trail boss would use that alignment to get his bearings and set the day's heading. In a world before GPS or even reliable maps of the territories they were crossing, that nightly ritual was essential. A crew could survive bad food for a while, Getting lost in hostile territory could kill them all. The area within 100 feet of the Chuckwagon was Cookie's sacred territory, governed by rules that every cowboy knew and respected. These weren't polite suggestions. They were iron laws, and breaking them could earn you anything from a tongue lashing to deliberate petty revenge that made the rest of the drive miserable. Never ride your horse near the wagon in a way that kicked up dust into the food or water. Out on the open prairie, dust was everywhere and unavoidable. But near the Chuckwagon, you dismounted and walked. Never start eating before Cookie gave the call, usually a shout of, "Come and get it," that carried across camp. When you filled your plate, you moved away from the fire to eat. The area right around the cooking fire was Cookie's workspace, not a dining room. Mealtime was for eating, not conversation. You ate, you moved on, and you kept quiet while doing it. And you never left food on your plate. That was a direct insult to the cook's effort and the recognition that out here, wasting food was wasting survival. Even the coffee pot had its own ritual. If a cowboy walked up to pour himself a cup and another man shouted, "Man at the pot," the cowboy was obligated to pour for anyone else who wanted one. It was a small thing, but it reinforced the culture of mutual dependence that kept a trail crew functional. No one was out here alone. Everyone relied on everyone else, and even something as simple as coffee was an opportunity to demonstrate that you understood the code. Cookie enforced these rules with a personality that was often described as temperamental, and that was putting it mildly. Some cooks were beloved father figures who led with gruff kindness. The others were tyrants who ran the Chuckwagon like a dictator's fiefdom. But even the kindest cook had limits, and crossing him was unwise. He controlled your food. He controlled the quality of your coffee. He knew when you'd be too tired to notice if he gave you slightly smaller portions or saved the best cuts for the cowboys he liked. And if you made him angry enough, he could make your life subtly miserable in ways that wouldn't violate the trail boss's rules, but would absolutely make you regret your choices. Burnt biscuits, weak coffee, beans that were somehow always undercooked when they landed on your plate. Nothing you could complain about officially, but enough to make every meal a reminder that you'd screwed up. The smartest cowboys understood the dynamic. Cookie held power, yes, but it was a power born from necessity and skill. He worked harder than almost anyone else on the drive, starting before everyone and finishing after most had gone to sleep. His success kept everyone else alive and functional. The food might be monotonous, the coffee might be strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe, but it was there every morning and every night without fail. Respecting him wasn't just about avoiding punishment, it was recognizing that the Chuckwagon and the man who ran it represented something bigger than food. It represented order and chaos, routine in an unpredictable world, and the basic human comfort of knowing that no matter how hard the day had been, there would be a hot meal waiting at the end of it. In a life defined by uncertainty and danger, Cookie was the one constant, the man who turned flour and fire into the closest thing to home that existed on the trail. But even the best cook in the world couldn't make magic without the right supplies. And of all the things carried in that wagon, one commodity was considered so essential that running out of it was nearly unthinkable. It wasn't food. It was what kept men awake during pre-dawn watches, what warmed them on freezing nights, and what gave them the jolt they needed to face another 16-hour day in the saddle. Coffee wasn't a luxury on the trail. It was survival in liquid form, and running out of it could break a crew's spirit faster than bad weather or difficult cattle. A cowboy's day started in darkness, often hours before sunrise, and it ended long after the sun went down. In between was exhausting. That monotonous work that required constant alertness. A man on night watch, circling the herd to keep them calm and prevent stampedes, needed to stay awake despite bone-deep fatigue. Coffee provided that. It was warmth on cold mornings when frost covered the bedrolls. It was a ritual that marked the transition from sleep to work, and it was strong, famously, brutally strong. The preparation method was simple but effective. Cookie would boil water in a large pot, then throw in a handful of coarsely ground coffee for every cup of water, sometimes more. No precise measurements, no delicate brewing. The grounds went straight into the boiling water and stayed there, settling to the bottom as the coffee steeped. The result was thick, dark, and potent enough to earn the nickname six-shooter coffee, based on the legend that it was strong enough to float a revolver. Some cowboys swore you could stand a spoon up in a properly made pot of trail coffee. Others joked that it would dissolve the enamel off your teeth if you drank it too hot. But strength wasn't a flaw. It was the point. Cowboys needed the caffeine jolt, and they needed it to last. The coffee was consumed black, always. There's no milk on the trail, and sugar was precious enough that most cowboys saved it for rare occasions. You drank it hot, strong, and without complaint, and you poured yourself another cup whenever the work demanded it. The real revolution in trail coffee came in the form of Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee. It's a brand that became so synonymous with cowboy life that Arbuckles became slang for coffee itself. Before Arbuckles, cooks had to deal with green coffee beans, which meant roasting them over the campfire, a difficult, time-consuming process that often resulted in burnt or unevenly roasted beans. The Arbuckle brothers patented a process for coating roasted beans in a glaze made from egg whites and sugar. This glaze sealed in the freshness and flavor, preventing the beans from going stale even after months of transport in a hot, jostling wagon. It also made the beans easier to grind and produced a more consistent brew. Arbuckles came in distinctive 1-pound packages, bright yellow with red lettering, and each package included a stick of peppermint candy as an incentive. Cowboys who drew the unpopular duty of grinding the coffee beans, a tedious job done with a hand crank mill, got to keep the candy as payment. The coffee itself became the standard on cattle drives across the West. It was reliable, it didn't spoil, and it tasted the same whether you were in Texas or Montana. For men whose lives were defined by uncertainty, that consistency mattered. Coffee served another purpose beyond caffeine and warmth. It was social glue. When the crew gathered around the Chuckwagon in the evening, coffee was what they held while they talked, told stories, or simply sat in exhausted silence. It marked moments of rest in a life that offered few of them. And the ritual of man at the pot, the rule that if you poured yourself a cup, you had to offer to pour for others, reinforced the culture of looking out for each other that kept trail crews functional. The other essential liquid on the trail was whiskey, though officially it was carried for medicinal purposes. In practice, it was the frontier cure-all, deployed for everything from snake bites to toothaches to simple exhaustion. A cowboy bitten by a rattlesnake would get a slug of whiskey to dull the pain and calm the panic while Cookie cleaned the wound. A man with a bad cough would be given whiskey mixed with honey if honey was available, or just straight whiskey if it wasn't. Even a broken bone might be set while the injured man took pulls from a bottle to get through the pain. Some trail bosses ran dry camps, forbidding alcohol entirely to prevent the fights and poor decisions that could follow. Thus others allowed it in limited quantities, trusting the crew to be responsible. But even on dry drives, Cookie usually had a bottle or two hidden in the Chuckwagon for genuine emergencies. The definition of emergency could be flexible: a particularly brutal day, a close call with the stampede, or simply the cook's judgment that morale needed a boost. But the whiskey was there when it was needed. The combination of strong coffee and occasional whiskey reveals something important about the trail diet that the food itself doesn't fully capture. Cowboys were constantly managing their bodies like machines that had to keep running no matter what. Coffee provided the energy to start the day and the alertness to stay safe. Whiskey dulled pain and provided warmth when the cold became dangerous. Neither was about pleasure. Both were about function. It's about keeping yourself operational in conditions that could kill you if you slowed down. But functionality had limits. No amount of coffee or whiskey could compensate for the fundamental nutritional deficiencies built into the trail diet. And those deficiencies had consequences that went far beyond discomfort. In a world where your body was the only tool you couldn't replace, coffee and whiskey weren't vices. They were the bare minimum required to keep that tool working. But keeping yourself awake and dulling pain only masked the deeper problem. The cowboy diet was built for calories, not health, and the price for that choice was paid in diseases that Hollywood never bothered to mention. The real killer on the trail wasn't gunfights or stampedes. It was something far more ordinary and far more deadly. Disease killed more cowboys than every gunfight, stampede, and riding accident combined, and it wasn't even close. The romantic image of the Old West focuses on dramatic deaths, shootouts at high noon, cattle stampedes in thunderstorms, desperados, and danger at every turn. The reality was far more mundane and far more brutal. A cowboy on a long cattle drive was far more likely to die from cholera, dysentery, or simple infected wounds than from anything involving a gun. The trail diet, for all its clever adaptations to the problem of preservation and portability, was a nutritional disaster. And the consequences of that disaster were written in the health of every man who spent months eating nothing but beef, beans, and biscuits. The most immediate and constant threat was scurvy, a disease caused by severe vitamin C deficiency. For men who went months without fresh fruits or vegetables, scurvy was always lurking. The early symptoms were easy to dismiss: fatigue, weakness, aching joints. Cowboys were tired and sore anyway from the work, so these signs often went unnoticed until the disease progressed. Then came the bleeding gums, the loosening teeth, the bruises that appeared without cause. In advanced cases, old wounds would reopen and new injuries wouldn't heal. Left untreated, scurvy was fatal. The cowboys' primary defense against scurvy was canned tomatoes. Tomatoes are rich in vitamin C, and canning technology had advanced enough by the mid-1800s that tinned tomatoes were relatively affordable and could survive the journey. A good cook would ration them carefully, making sure every man got some regularly, often mixing them into stews or serving them as a side. It wasn't a perfect solution. Canned tomatoes alone couldn't provide all the vitamin C a working man needed, but it was enough to keep scurvy at bay for most crews most of the time. When tomatoes ran out or supplies ran low, cowboys turned to wild plants. Sheep sorrel, with its tart, lemony flavor, provided vitamin C and was common enough that a knowledgeable cook could gather it while the wagon moved from camp to camp. Wild onions served a similar purpose. Even prickly pear cactus, when carefully processed to remove the spines, offered both nutrition and moisture in desert country where water was scarce. But scurvy wasn't the only nutritional threat. The trail diet was also deficient in vitamin A, leading to night blindness and increased susceptibility to infections. The iron deficiency caused anemia, leaving men weak and unable to work at full capacity. The relentless sameness of the diet, beef, beans, biscuits, repeat, meant that even when calories were adequate, the body was slowly being starved of essential nutrients it needed to function. Beyond nutritional deficiencies, the conditions of trail life created perfect circumstances for infectious disease. Water sources were often contaminated, shared with the cattle, or polluted by upstream camps. Cowboys drank from rivers and streams without any way to purify the water, leading to outbreaks of cholera and dysentery that could tear through a crew in days. Cholera was particularly feared. It struck fast, causing violent diarrhea and vomiting that could dehydrate a man to death within hours. There was no real treatment beyond rest, clean water if it could be found, and hope. Dysentery was slower, but just as deadly. The constant diarrhea weakened men gradually, making them unable to work, unable to eat, unable to recover. In a world where stopping meant losing time and money, sick cowboys were often expected to keep working as long as they could stay in the saddle. The result was that minor illnesses became major ones, and major ones became fatal. Unsanitary conditions around camp contributed to the spread of disease. Cowboys wore the same clothes for weeks or months, washing them rarely, if at all. They shared eating utensils and drinking cups. They slept in close quarters, often sharing bedrolls. When one man got sick, the disease spread easily to others. Cookie did his best to maintain cleanliness around the Chuckwagon. But there were limits to what could be done with limited water, no soap, and a crew that was too exhausted to care about hygiene. Injuries were another constant threat, and on the trail, even minor wounds could become life-threatening. A cut from barbed wire, a puncture from a horse's hoof, a scrape from a fall, any of these could become infected in the dirty conditions of trail life. Without antibiotics or proper medical care, infection often meant fever, delirium, and sometimes death. Cookie would clean wounds as best he could, sometimes with whiskey to disinfect, sometimes with whatever folk remedies he knew. He might pack a wound with salt to draw out infection, or apply a poultice made from plants he'd gathered. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. The sheer exhaustion of trail life made everything worse. Cowboys worked 16-hour days, slept on the hard ground, and pushed through pain and fatigue because there was no alternative. Exhausted men made mistakes. They fell off horses, they got kicked by cattle, they mishandled equipment. And exhausted bodies couldn't fight off disease the way rested ones could. The combination of poor nutrition, constant exposure to the elements, inadequate sleep, and relentless physical labor created a perfect storm for illness and injury. The trail boss and Cookie did what they could to keep the crew healthy, but they were working with severe limitations. Medical knowledge in the 1800s was primitive by modern standards. Germ theory was barely understood. The connection between sanitation and disease was recognized but not fully grasped. Treatment options were limited to what could be carried in the Chuckwagon. Whiskey for pain, a few basic tools for setting bones or pulling teeth, and whatever folk wisdom the cook had picked up over the years. The trail didn't care how tough you were or how well you could ride. It found the weaknesses in your body that the diet created and exploited them without mercy. Yet, Despite the diseases, the deficiencies, and the daily dangers, cowboys kept signing up for drives. They kept eating the same foods, following the same routines, accepting the same risks. Because at the end of the trail was something that made it all worthwhile, or at least something that made it survivable. After months of eating beans, jerky, and hardtack, the first thing a cowboy did when he reached the end of the trail wasn't visit a saloon, it was find a restaurant. The cattle drives of the Great Era typically ended in railroad towns like Abilene, Dodge City, or Cheyenne, places where the cattle could be loaded onto trains and shipped east to slaughterhouses and markets. These towns existed primarily to serve the cattle trade, and they knew exactly what trail-weary cowboys wanted. The moment a crew arrived and the herd was penned, the cowboys had money in their pockets for the first time in months and a hunger for food that actually had flavor, variety, and most importantly, wasn't cooked in a Dutch oven over a cow chip fire. The restaurants in these trail towns weren't fancy establishments. They were utilitarian operations designed to feed large numbers of men quickly and cheaply. But compared to months of trail food, they might as well have been serving cuisine from Paris. The menus were simple but revelatory. Fried chicken, pork chops, beefsteaks that were actually tender, mashed potatoes with real butter, vegetables that hadn't come from a can, fresh baked bread that didn't require soaking to be edible, and pies, apple, cherry, peach, made with real fruit and sugar. Cowboys would walk into these establishments still covered in trail dust, their clothes stiff with sweat and dirt, and order portions that shocked even the hardened restaurant owners who'd seen it all. A man who'd been eating a pound of food a day might suddenly consume 3 or 4 pounds in a single sitting. A steak, then another steak, then fried chicken, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and multiple slices of pie. They weren't being gluttonous in the traditional sense. Their bodies were desperately trying to catch up on months of nutritional deficits, and they ate with a focused intensity that had nothing to do with enjoyment and everything to do with need. The variety was what hit them hardest. After eating essentially the same meal 3 times a day for months, the simple act of choosing what to eat felt like luxury. Vegetables, even basic ones like carrots or cabbage, tasted extraordinary after months without them. Fresh milk was almost shocking in its richness. Butter, which didn't exist on the trail because it couldn't survive without refrigeration, was slathered on everything. Sugar, which had been carefully rationed if available at all, was now unlimited, and cowboys would sweeten their coffee until it was nearly syrup. And some of the more established trail town restaurants became famous among cowboys, developing reputations that spread through word of mouth. A restaurant known for particularly good steaks or exceptional pies could draw cowboys from multiple outfits, all eager to taste something they'd been dreaming about for weeks. These establishments understood their clientele. They served large portions, didn't complain about dirty customers, and kept their prices reasonable enough that a cowboy's wages could cover several meals. Some even offered special trails and dinners, multi-course affairs designed specifically for newly arrived crews who wanted to eat everything they'd been missing. But the eating didn't stop at restaurants. Cowboys would visit general stores and stock up on treats that were impossible to carry on the trail. Canned peaches and pears, eaten straight from the tin with a spoon, were particular favorites. Crackers that weren't rock hard, cheese which some cowboys hadn't tasted in months or even years, pickles whose sour, salty flavor was a shock to systems that had been living on bland food, hard candy which cowboys would buy by the pound and slowly work through, savoring each piece as a reminder that they'd survived another drive. The saloons, when cowboys finally got to them, served food as well as whiskey. The free lunch was a common feature in Western saloons, a spread of food available to paying customers that typically included things like sliced meats, cheese, bread, pickles, hard-boiled eggs, and sometimes more elaborate offerings like stews or sandwiches. The food was deliberately salty to encourage drinking, but cowboys didn't care. It was free, it was varied, and it wasn't beans. The contrast between trail food and town food revealed something important about what the cowboys had been eating for months. Trail food wasn't designed to satisfy, it was designed to sustain. There's no pleasure built into it, no consideration for taste beyond edible enough to consume repeatedly. Town food, even the simple offerings of trail town restaurants, was designed for satisfaction. It had seasoning beyond salt, it had variety, it had texture and flavor that came from cooking methods more sophisticated than boiling or frying in beef grease. Some cowboys would eat themselves sick in those first days in town, their bodies unable to handle the sudden influx of rich food after months of sparse, bland fare. Stomach aches and digestive distress were common enough that it became part of the expected rhythm of reaching the end of a drive. But they do it again at the next town, unable to resist the temptation to eat everything they've been craving. The economic impact of these eating binges was significant. A cowboy might earn $30 or $40 for a month's work on the trail, which was decent money for the era. But a substantial portion of that could disappear in the first few days in town, spent on meals at restaurants, treats from general stores, and drinks at saloons that came with those free lunch spreads. Trail bosses and outfit owners knew this pattern and sometimes tried to pay the men in installments to prevent them from blowing everything immediately. But cowboys generally resisted such paternalism. They'd earned their wages through months of hardship, and if they wanted to spend half of it on food that wasn't jerky and beans, that was their choice to make. The cultural memory of these trails end feasts became part of cowboy lore. Old cowboys would tell stories about legendary meals they'd eaten in Dodge City or Abilene, with the same enthusiasm they brought to tales of stampedes or river crossings. A particularly good steak or an exceptional pie could be remembered for years, described in detail to younger cowboys who hadn't yet made their first drive. These weren't just meals. They were markers of survival, celebrations of having endured another season on the trail, proof that the months of hardship and monotonous food hadn't been for nothing. But the feasting couldn't last. Eventually, the money ran out or the cowboy signed on for another job, and it was back to simpler fare. Some cowboys would take jobs at ranches where the food was better than trail rations, but still basic. They might get regular access to fresh meat and vegetables, but the variety and abundance of town eating was gone. Others would sign on for another drive, knowing full well what they were getting into, and within days they'd be back to the holy trinity of beef, beans, and biscuits, the memory of town food fading into a goal to work toward for the next few months. The cycle revealed the true nature of the cowboy diet. It wasn't just about what they ate on the trail. It was about the sharp contrast between deprivation and abundance, between survival rations and actual satisfaction. Trail food kept them alive and working. Town food reminded them why they bothered. For men who spent most of their lives eating to survive, those few days of eating for pleasure weren't indulgence. They were the whole point. But eventually, the money would run low, the next job would call, and a cowboy would find himself back at a chuckwagon, looking at a plate of beans and remembering what real food tasted like. The cycle would begin again, because this was the bargain at the heart of cowboy life. Endure months of hardship for moments of relief. Eat the same bland meals for the privilege of occasionally eating something better, and accept that the trail would always call you back to its brutal, monotonous rhythms. The romantic image of the cowboy sitting peacefully by a campfire, a simple plate of beans on his lap, was never the whole truth. It wasn't even close. The real story of what cowboys ate is a story of brutal practicality meeting desperate ingenuity. It's a story of men who turned the organs of nursing calves into celebrated stews, who fried the byproducts of castration and called them delicacies, who gnawed on jerky hard enough to break teeth, because it was the only protein that wouldn't spoil. It's a story of a diet so monotonous that beans earned affectionate nicknames, so deficient that scurvy was a constant threat, and so carefully calculated that every single food choice came down to 3 questions. Will it spoil? Can we carry it? Does it have enough calories? The Chuckwagon and the cook who ruled it weren't romantic additions to the cowboy myth. They were the absolute center of survival on the trail. The cookie's power came from a simple reality. He stood between the crew and starvation, and in that position, he commanded more day-to-day respect than anyone except the trail boss himself. His coffee was strong enough to float a gun, his rules were absolute, and his ability to turn limited ingredients into edible meals was what kept crews functional through months of grinding labor. What cowboys actually ate wasn't the stuff of Hollywood legend. It was the mathematics of survival, played out 3 times a day in tin plates and cast iron skillets. It was beef they rarely tasted fresh, beans that took 24 hours to prepare, bread that ranged from a cook's pride to something you could use as building material, and on special occasions, food so strange that modern eaters would struggle to keep them down. But it worked. It kept men alive across hundreds of miles of hostile country. It fueled one of the most demanding jobs in 19th century America. And when it was finally over, when the drive ended and the cowboys hit town, they ate like men who'd been starving. Because in every way that mattered beyond pure calories, they had been.